Friends, welcome back to the channel, and we continue the dramatic reading of The Return of the Indian, Book 2 of the Indian in the Cupboard series by the one and only Lynne Reid Banks, and we are on Chapter 18, Algonquin. There was an air of fear about the village. As twilight fell, the villagers seemed to be preparing to decamp. Remember, Omri and Patrick have somehow gotten back in time to where Little Bear and Bright Stars' village is. They're somehow being able to access it through the teepee that they brought back in time, put in this chest, and used the magic key to bring them back. And they found out that Little Bear has made it back with his troop of Indians who are armed with modern weapons, and they're hiding out in the mountains, in the hills rather, waiting for the Algonquins, their sworn enemies, to come back and attack the village. So the villagers were preparing to decamp. Such men as were left, mainly old, plus some wounded or unfit ones, were giving orders, and the women were running, here and there, packing things into bundles. Others came with buckets of water to put out the few cooking fires that were burning, removed the pots, and rounded up the children. A few dogs were dashing about, barking excitedly, sensing something in the hurrying and anxious voices. I know our dog does that, right? You can kind of tell when you're packing up, you're going on a trip or something. Omri watched all this in growing alarm. The minutes were ticking by, being apparently nothing more than a picture. Oh, I'm sorry. I said earlier that Omri and Patrick had traveled back in time. That's not true. Patrick had traveled back previously, come back. Now Omri got a turn, and Patrick was supposed to turn the key to let him back into their current modern world in England, in Great Britain rather, except minutes have gone by past the time they agreed, and Patrick hasn't turned the key yet. So what's up? Minutes were ticking by, being apparently nothing more than a picture on the side of the teepee. He couldn't see how he could be in danger himself, but he was desperately worried about Bright Stars, Boone, and the baby. After a while, one of the old women came around the teepee into Omri's sight. She was hobbling along as fast as she could, gazing up at the teepee with gaping mouth as if it had dropped from nowhere, as, in a way, it had. She bent the flap and called. Bright Stars answered. The old woman hobbled away again, her white hair glowing in the deep twilight. The tall pines around the camp now stood out black against the darkening sky. Omri heard Bright Stars in the teepee say to Boone, "Village leave now." "What's that? Leave for where?" "Hide in wood." There was a pause. Then she said doubtfully, "Boone come?" "No, I can't." "Why no? Here not safe." "They're not safe. Not for me. And I don't fit in, gal. You know that." Bright Stars said no more. There was a pause. Then the teepee flap opened, and she came out with her baby wrapped up in some hide from her shirt, her hide torn from her shirt. She turned in the opening. There was a very soft look in her eyes as she looked, presumably at Boone, standing out of Omri's sight inside. Then she hurried away, mingling with the knot of other Indians in the center of the village. Soon they were forming into a rough procession. It was almost too dark to see now, but Omri could just make them out as they silently made their way out of the circle of the ruined and half-burnt buildings. Even the dogs were quiet now as they trailed along after the villagers. One of them, lingering, passed the teepee. He paused to leave his mark against the side of it, and for a moment he looked up, straight at Omri. His lips drew back over teeth which shone white in the darkness, and he whined uneasily. The hair on his back stood up straight. Then he tucked his long tail between his legs and shot off after the others. Soon the last rustles and murmurs subsided, and there was a deep silence, broken only by the call of a single owl. Bird or signal? Omri had never known real fear. All he could compare this with was walking up Hovel Road and knowing he had to pass the skinheads who were waiting for him. Remember that from the earlier chapters. He kind of bullies at the arcade that he has to pass on the way home. That seemed to him now like nothing at all. What were the worst they could do to him, after all? A black eye? A few bruises? This was in another category of fear altogether. Yet, what was he afraid of? Nothing could happen to him. At any second now, Patrick would turn the key in the lock of the chest and recall him to his body. to normality, to the utter blissful safety of his own life, which he had never thought about before, far less appreciated. So what was this icy feeling, which could only be terror? Perhaps it was for Boone. Boone was behind him in the teepee, no longer a tiny figure, but a full-sized man, out of his place, out of his time, visible, solid, vulnerable, and quite alone. How lonely could you be? Omri could hardly imagine how Boone must be feeling as he waited in the teepee for some unknown thing to happen. And suddenly, it did. It began with another hoot from the owl. Then Omri saw a swift movement to one side of him, close to the edge of the clearing. Then again on the other side. Then a man's figure, crouched low, scurried past him. And abruptly the whole clearing seemed to be full of moving men. They were not Frenchmen, of course. They were Indians. Little Bear's men, returning to defend the place. Omri strained to see them. All he could make out was glimpses of leggings, a head feather, the flash of an axe head catching the starlight. Then he saw that several men were raking wood from the cooking fires into one heap in the center of the ring of longhouses. Shadows began to spread from a light source in the midst of the men. Suddenly a flame leapt high, and another. The fire had been lit, and at once Omri could see. These weren't... there's the beaver painting on the teepee that Omri's somehow, embodied into. Because you remember, they had plastic figures that turned into people, and then they turned back to plastic figures. There's like an object that then turns into human and then back to object. So Omri and Patrick go into this chest as humans. They need to kind of turn into an object. I guess, is how the sci-fi part of this book is sort of working, if you follow that logic. So he had to kind of turn into something, which was the teepee and this little beaver, to exist in that world. And that's like their equivalent of like a toy or a totem of some kind, with the way a figure is for us in the modern world. Now, this is the people who are out in the village. You can see with the torch. So they weren't Little Bear's men, actually. Their clothes were different. Their heads were shaved. Their headdresses, even their movements, were alien. And their faces, too. Their faces. They were wild, distorted, terrifying masks of hatred and rage. They were Algonquins, come to sack the village. In the light of the central fire, they ran to and fro, dozens of them, scores. It took only moments to find out that they had been outwitted, that the village was empty, and there was nothing to steal. No women to carry off. Now, I'd also like to think, I'm commentary here off the side, that many Native American tribes performed raids against each other and were warlike, and to people like us be considered brutal. So I don't think this is anything against the Algonquin nation. It sounds like the Iroquois and the Algonquin were at war for a while, and just what bits I've picked up from history and books and shows and things like that, it seems that that these different tribes were brutal to each other, and that's what kind of brought that out of each other's, that sort of life or death warfare, as these two nations were rubbing up against each other in this part of the world at this time. So I just want to be fair to whatever depiction or showing of the Algonquin tribe here. I'm sure it's turnaround is fair play. They had similar treatment from those they war against, like the Iroquois. Okay. So there were no women to carry off. Their anger burst out in howls and yelps. Through this outburst, Omri heard a smothered groan below him. Boone! He must be peering out at the awful scene. Now the Indians were dipping branches into the big fire to make torches. They were dancing and shouting and leaping. Several of them were running to the few unburnt longhouses, and suddenly Omri knew. He knew what he had feared. They were going to burn the teepee, and he was part of it. Ah! The teepee was on the edge of the clearing. There were other things to set on fire first, but they would get to him. They were coming closer, their howls fiercer, their torches swirling in clouds of smoke above their half-naked heads. Omri began screaming, silently. Patrick! Patrick, do it now! Turn the key! Bring me home! Save me! he saw an Indian making straight for him. His face, in the torchlight, was twisted with fury. Save me. Wait, this one. Save me, Patrick. Twisted with fury. For a second, Omri saw, under the shaven scalp, decorated with a single scalp lock, the mindless, destructive face of a skinhead just before he lashed out. The torch went back with the man's right arm. There was a split second's pause, and then it came hurtling through the air and struck the panel of hide just beside Omri. It slithered down to the ground and lay there, its flame chewing the bottom edge. The Algonquin licked his lips, snarling like a dog, and ran back to the central fire. Omri had not realized he could smell as well as see and hear. Now he smelt smoke, the stench of burning hide. It was dry, and it caught quickly. In helpless horror, Omri watched the burnt area growing up beside him like a letter A edged with flame. He hardly noticed another Indian approaching from the other side with another blazing brand, that's a stick of wood that's on fire, until suddenly, out of the daze of fear he had fallen into, Omri heard a loud bang. The Indian left the ground briefly. His fingers jerked open. The torch fell. Then the man did the same, dropped like a stone, and lay motionless on his back while the branch burnt harmlessly beside him. All the others stopped dead, their grim faces turned towards the teepee. The shot had come from below. Omri saw the tip of a revolver barrel poking out of a slit in the hide just underneath him. And as the whole pack of Algonquin began to run, howling and yelling toward the teepee, their monstrous shadows sliding along the ground ahead of them, more shots rang out, and 2, then 3 more Indians fell. The others hesitated, then scattered. The fire burnt clear in the center, unattended. The fire that was eating the teepee burnt too. Inside, behind him, Omri could hear and even feel Boone frantically beating at the licking flames with something. His hat, perhaps? And cursing. But it was useless. The fire was spreading. "Get out, Boone! Run! Run, Boone! Run into the forest! Save yourself!" That's what Omri's kind of thinking in his head, but it's a beaver painting. You can't hear him. Smoke flowed past the painted animal Omri was inhabiting and blinded him. Wow, that's the end of the chapter. Is Omri going to get out of this? Is Patrick going to turn that key and bring him back to safety in time, if ever? Let's find out on the next chapter. Please subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like. It always encourages me, or a comment, any feedback on what I'm reading, how I'm reading, what you'd like me to read next. So it's always nice. All right. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one.